Welcome to Comic Books and You. Today we are going to do something a little bit different. I grabbed Dark Horse Comics The Ward last week a bit randomly. Was sitting on the shelf there for quite some time, but it's the first time I really saw it. So I picked it up because I thought it looked pretty cool from the cover. I thought it would be a nice change of pace to go with something completely different this time around. This is an hospital procedural, so a type of comic you probably don't see all that often, as well as being urban fantasy, which is not the most common style of storytelling either, depending on the circle in which you gravitate. So it's something rather different that we're going to have a nice time looking at together. Our main character through this is Natalie Reeves, who's a young black woman that, well, she can't really be all that young since she's actually a doctor and actually works in insurance now. I mean, 3 years of 4 years for a bachelor's in the U.S. plus 2 years for a master's, 3 years residency. Adding things up, I mean, she can't be any younger than early 30s. But still, she lives in Curtin, Illinois, which seems to be a mid-sized town. I haven't done the research on the city itself. I don't know if it even exists. She used to work at an hospital called St. Lillith's, which is an hospital for the supernatural. So for all sorts of ghoulies, ghosts, goblins, and all. But she had a very bad experience there and kind of left that line of work to start working in insurance. She also seems to have some issues with her mother that doesn't want her to work crazy hours. Being a doctor and working crazy hours kind of go hand in hand when you're starting out, let's say. Once you get a little bit older, you can usually justify whatever hours you're working. She believes that everyone at St. Lilith hates her because she left. We don't get that too much from what the other characters are doing in the story, but that's how she is feeling. Even with having stopped practicing for a little while, she's still a great doctor. Our main patient in this story is Valmira Kreshnik, who's a not so young woman that works at St. Lilith, as we'll go with say that she's a psychiatrist. She has a huge gash on the side of her body. She can't seem to regenerate. She can't seem to come back to her senses at all. Seems to be a very difficult injury. I mean, loss of blood seems to be pretty bad there as well. She's still friendly enough with Natalie to go to her when she has an emergency. Maybe she was also nearby and knew where she lives. She didn't call the hospital right away. She ran and went to Natalie's after her injury. Our third, let's say, most important character is Starn, which is a big black Minotaur who had one of his horn ripped off. He runs with a gang of supernatural creatures called the Chimeras, who love pain because pain reminds them that they're alive. In order to do that, he studs iron into his flesh. Iron is extremely bad for supernatural creatures. This is a thing that you would see a lot in fairy stories, where unrough iron, cold iron, would be very nasty when for Fays and other creatures. He's very hard-headed in both ways, both as a being set in his ways and the fact that the Minotaur skull kind of needs an industrial drill in order to pierce through it. There are other characters throughout this stories, but most of them have barely supporting roles or are just there as set dressing in a way. Really, those three are what drive this story forward. We'll still see a few other characters as we go through the story itself. So Nat is late to pick up what I suppose is her niece because she told her mother she would go pick up a kid, and it's not one of her kids, and I doubt it's her mother's, 6-year-old. That would be a very big difference in age. So she rushes home to get her laptop after a long day of work that appears to be extremely boring, and rushes upstairs and sees her neighbor Wilfred holding Valmira Kreshnik, who was banging on the door before collapsing. Nat takes care of the situation very quickly and tells Wilfred to bring her inside her house and start doing basic first aid, compressing the injury, trying to do a basic bandage, and a quick look at the injury. And our heroine decides that she'll do what she really didn't want to do and call St. Lilith's Hospital. Of course, at that point, Wilfred does notice that Valmira has a tail, so that makes him a little bit confused as to what's going on. Obviously, that's a just to say that Valmira is a some sort of supernatural creature. Wilfred, Valmira, and Nat rush to St. Lilith's Hospital in an ambulance. Nat saying that the ambulance driver doesn't like her. She, as I said in the early part of this review here, she believes everybody at St. Lilith's hates her. So they drive through a wall, which brings them to St. Lilith's. This is a thing that we've seen in Harry Potter as well, driving through a wall to get into a supernatural location. You'll see in this, throughout this review here, a lot of this particular book goes by the paint by number kind of way. It works. It is not as imaginative as it wants to be. Wilfred, of course, is kind of stunned by what is going on. He kind of follows through with Valmira and Nat as they admit her into the hospital. Right as that happened, another patient, Starn the Minotaur, gets admitted, saying that there's a grave injury as well. I mean, he had one of his horn ripped off. That would generally kill a bull, just so you know. And the nurse that was helping out with Valmira splits into two in order to be able to assist with boat issues. I hope she gets paid double when she splits into two, and if she splits more afterwards, she gets paid even more. I mean, that would be my expectation in that situation. The head physician of the ER is a ghost, and she lends her crystal scope to Nat so she can try to figure out what injury she has and what her problem is. And the new resident is trying to contain the Minotaur, who is rather irate and angry, even with a potentially mortal wound on his head. The Minotaur goes into shock just a little while after, kind of what I would have expected here. The resident has to save him, do the whole procedure in the ER and not in an operation room. He grabs a drill and tries to pierce through the skull to relieve pressure using an obsidian drill bit, but it's not strong enough to go to the brain. Nat realizes that and tells him to use a worm tooth drill, which is an industrial tool, and that actually manages to save our patient. When she comes to that realization, Nat also comes to the conclusion that Val and Starn had gotten into a fight. Val had ripped the horn off Starn's head and tried to run away. Starn stabbed her with the horn, which had an iron stud put through it. So what was actually preventing Valmira from recovering and getting better even with treatment was the iron in the that had now dislodged into her body. Both patients are saved thanks to Nat's quick thinking. Wilfred tries to process the whole thing, and they bring him to Valmira, who uses her power to basically erase his memory because they don't want him to remember that he was in that hospital. In the end, Natalie decides to go back to working at St. Lilith's in the last panels of the comic, and we see her admitting a merman who was drowning. That sounds a little bit weird, but it's meant to be weird. That's what this particular book is all about. Overall, it is a good story. Like I said, very paint by number. If you start looking at it through the details, it works for what it is supposed to be. Like I said there, and it is an enjoyable read overall. There's very little in there that doesn't catch your attention and wants you to keep reading through it. It's also a kind of story that works for 7 to 77. Anybody could really read this. And even someone who's not into urban fantasy but like hospital procedurals might enjoy it People who like urban fantasy but don't like hospital procedurals might still like it. So it has still able to cast a fairly large net overall. The cover is really what drove me to buy this particular book. It's basically been rotting on the spinner rack for a year at this point. It was dates from July 2022, but it's the first time I see it. I have to say that I don't really always look at the indie comic or the dark horse section in the rack. But when I saw the cover, I was really attracted to it. I mean, you've got to focus on the injured Minotaur, the people bringing him in. Everything kind of works for the story itself here. If it had been Val on the stretcher, it wouldn't have been as exciting. It would have been just another woman being brought into an hospital. Yeah, you would have the big green guy in the back. That's the only thing that would have looked a little bit weird. With a Minotaur, you get immediately the idea of what's going on here. So it is overall an extremely good cover and probably one of the better ones we've seen over the months we've been reviewing things. I really like urban fantasy. It's a thing that I've enjoyed quite a bit since I heard and played of Shadowrun back in the days. I've always wanted to play in that type of setting a little bit more, not just as an RPG, but as a writer and as a designer. More urban fantasy and less cyberpunk. This is a nice way of treating that type of material, basically. We're going to go through the peritext fairly quickly. There isn't much that I really want to talk about here. The cover itself is basically your standard American comic fare, so a kind of gloss paper. Here it's not a cardboard or a cardstock cover. But the pages themselves in the book, they're a step up from what I would say the standard DC fare is. So it's a little bit better than normal, but a little bit less than what you'd see from, let's say, the Whatnot people, the Ripaverse, Scout Comics, Massive Publishing, these kinds of indie people. I won't go into depth in the different ads that are in there. All the ads are for older Dark Horse material. The Collector, we had that one from Mignola right before that. There's nothing revenue generating in there. It's all trying to move other products from their own line. Is that a bad thing? Not really, but you're not filling the coffers from it. And honestly, a lot of those books don't look super interesting, unfortunately. The last page of the ad is you're in the next issue little section where we have a giantess giving birth. That actually sounds interesting and would be something that I might want to go through, basically, as far as the book goes. Interesting stories overall, and something that likely would work in a hospital procedural story. Artistic merits, this is pretty much where this book shines. The art here is really good overall. The humans all look pretty good. There's no weird proportion issue, there's no weird warping. Nobody is looks inhuman as far as the humans go. So everything looks normal and not exaggerated. So we have a fairly large group of characters here. The supernatural creatures and the supernatural elements are all from pretty great to really good in there. We have a huge range of them in the book, thanks to that two-pager at the bottom, and a few of the pages where we just see the ward itself. So it's fun to have a nurse who's able to split. It's fun to have a crystal scope instead of a regular stethoscope. In the double page, we see all sorts of creatures. And another great thing about it is that we do see them with day-to-day injury. I mean, there's a kid with a patch over the eye because he probably bunked it. There's a jack-o'-lantern guy with a broken arm. All fairly standard kind of things. That's fun to see and puts the whole situation in context. The injuries are well represented, not the greatest. They went with very traumatic injuries for issue 1. There might be not enough bleeding from that horn being cut, but we get nothing that's unusual here and nothing that would go against our sense of decency, let's say. This is for a hospital drama. This works really well. Backgrounds are somewhat weak. We've got a lot of one tone gradient panels. And when there are backgrounds, they're usually extremely simple or very simple. We have a city street here in the back. It has the necessary elements to it, but it's not top of the line. It's basically enough to immerse us in the story and not take us out of it, but not enough to have us like look into it in details. Mechanical design, we really only get the ambulance, and it's nothing fantastic. It's respectable, it does what it's supposed to do. It's a thing that you can easily get reference material for. It's respectable, it's workable. If we looked at other issues, maybe we'd see something different. The double page introduction of St. Lillith is where we have a lot of work. Like I said, we see all sorts of things on there. The building itself is not the best, but it works for what it's supposed to do. Dark Horse famously said that comics are not for straight white boys anymore. Of course, that was before they were sold off to Embracer Group because they weren't making any money, even though they were one of the biggest slash bigger manga publisher in the US. So you do have to take that statement, let's say, with a grain of salt. And this particular comic, well, this is where we might have to dig into things that are not the most pleasant to talk about. This is really a case of the super competent, diverse woman of color and probably sexuality in display. Normally, that doesn't get me on the defensive. I'm not a huge fan of the girl that's the key to everything, but normally, if I'm reading comics or I'm going through books, it's a stylistic choice. It's an idea that you decided to take for your story. As long as it makes sense, I'm not going to criticize it. The problem is that it's so common nowadays, it's such a tired trope that this is all we're getting nowadays. If you get almost any new stories or new material, it's going to fall into that particular category. And if you have older material being adapted, well, it's going to be turned into that anyways. This is a fairly significant issue and can cause you to completely disconnect from a story. The other bit we have here is that every male character is either less competent than their female counterpart, the resident who's helping in the hospital and trying to treat Starn the Minotaur. They're rather bad at their job in keeping their cool, the orc or troll security guard. That's what he basically represent. Or they're downright evil. In the case of Starn, that's a gang member that's driven by revenge. Because the reason he attacked Val is because I will expect it's one of his homies died and he got his memories ripped out of him. I'm not going to go any further than that because you could probably read into it as well, a little bit deeper. It is extremely subtle, like we say sometimes. That's part one of the paint by numbers, basically. Well, urban fantasy is also paint by number in this case. It's nothing fantastic or special. Secret hospital for secret magical creatures. Sounds good on paper, but it's something that's tried. We've seen it already multiple times on the police side of the equation. Now we're seeing it on the hospital side of the equation. Those types of procedurals, they all fall in the same category, so it's just more of the same. It's not as clever as the author and the creators probably thought it would. Same with the fact that the hospital is underfunded, it's understaffed. It's a thing that we've seen 1,000 times in hospital procedurals. It adds to the drama, yes, but again, it's a paint by number kind of thing. And if you're the only hospital taking care of supernatural creatures in your region, you will not be underfunded. Supernatural creatures will have money and will invest that money in your hospital to skirt taxes. At first, let's go with that, but also to be sure that they are taken care of if they get injured. That's a bit unusual here, a kind of thing that I probably would have not used in this particular story. We've got the doctor that walked away after a hard case. Again, paint by number. This is something that we've seen a million times. I think that just as bad is the fact that they're erasing people's memory when they have bad experiences in that hospital. That's absolutely not something you should do with trauma victims, or you'll end up with situation like Starn trying to kill Valmira because of it, or you're going to end up with people just being absolutely oblivious to what's going on. You have that kind of thing in Final Fantasy Agito versus 13, or however they've decided to title it. You've got that kind of story element in it, and it does show that forgetting people who die, not always the best thing to do. If you do it on regular humans, you're also, causing other issues. Wilfred, that you've just mind wiped here, could have volunteered at the hospital to help out. You always need volunteers in hospital, just to direct traffic or do all sorts of little things or cookie drives, things like that. He could have donated money to the hospital foundation. Maybe he's an accountant. He's really good at his job and you could have hired him at the hospital. There's all sorts of things here. Basically, that's a problem that you have whenever you go in urban fantasy where where you have that secret world next to the real world. I think about the only story that did it really well was Bright with Will Smith. That worked because it was urban fantasy with the fantasy elements being in your face. That's something that's far less paint by number and a lot of fun to play with. You have the same thing in Shadowrun as an example as well. We do get a huge variety of supernatural creatures in this. Here we have a Wendigo, we have a goblin, we have a kitsune, we have a dragon in the back, we've got an immortal flying on a cloud. I think we've got an angel. So you've got all sorts of things just in that panel and a few other panels as well. You see other things. The nurse is a fetch who has the ability to split. The ed physician is a ghost, a Japanese ghost. You had a two-headed giant, you had a troll or an orc. So you had really all sorts of things in there. And they're not playing those supernatural creatures as really something extra. They're just supernatural creatures that happen to have an injury or something of the sort. That's okay. I'm not sure I enjoyed it all. Supernatural creatures, or preternatural creatures as they call them here, are allergic to iron. That should be a Fae thing. I mean, vampires are allergic to garlic, werewolves to silver, well, werewolves to silver and wolfsbane, Faes to cold iron, different things like that. It allows for more story elements. The pacing here is good overall, in my opinion. We'll go through it here and we'll see that it's an hospital procedural. It's a very common thing on TV. You've all seen House, ER, Royal Pains, you name it, there's been quite a few. But I don't really remember hospital procedurals being very common in comics. So it's a style that we're not used to in comics, so the pacing for it is a little bit off. But in many cases, hospital procedurals are basically police procedurals in disguise. You have a team or your main characters trying to find a cause and a treatment for a disease in the same way detectives would do with a crime. This book here is not an exception. We've got four parts that would be the four parts more or less of an investigation. You find the body or the patient, you take the patient to the hospital, or you study the crime scene, treating the patient, and then you release them. So you've got four scenes, four sections, and in this case here, release is more for Wilfred than for the patients, but overall, we have those four elements and they're integrated in the story fairly well. We don't have a whole lot of breathing room in the book as well, and that's great because it's meant to be an eye adrenaline kind of situation, just like let's say a 30-minute hospital procedural. Final thoughts. Well, outside of the suspicious amount of diverse and super competent women, I would say this is a pretty decent comic. If it wasn't the case with every single piece of mainstream media out there, I wouldn't care. As it is now saturated, it gets on my nerves. It kind of feels like you're trying to pitch a TV series. When you read a book like this with all the necessary elements for a mainstream media story, Well, were you trying to write a comic or were you trying to pitch a story to Netflix in hope that they were going to pick it up? Urban fantasy is more common in comics than in all other genre combined, in my opinion. But when you keep reusing the same tropes over and over and you keep going paint by number, it kind of loses some of its appeal. This is far from a terrible comic, okay? I've seen way worse. I've read way worse. It's just that it's filled with tropes that I'm tired of, and I'm not sure I want to keep reading that story. Sure, there's people out there that will enjoy it. I'm sure there's people out there that have appreciated it in the past that will tell me in length as to why I'm wrong. There is a trade paperback for this that is coming out incessantly. It had 10 days left on the pre-order on Capcan yesterday. If you're interested in the Ward, get the trade paperback. I might if I've got some loose change floating around, but it won't be a priority for me. So I thank you very much for spending your time listening to me. I hope you have a very nice rest of your day. Keep on reading comics, keep on enjoying them. I'll keep analyzing them, and I'll see you guys later. Bye bye.